In the oldest surviving manuscripts of the Book of Job, written somewhere between the 5th and 3rd centuries before the Common Era, the figure who afflicts Job with disease and ruin is not a rebel. He is not a fallen angel. He is not evil. He sits in the divine council among the sons of God, and he is doing his job. That single fact rewrites everything you were taught about the devil. If Satan began as a loyal servant of the divine, a celestial prosecutor operating within the system, authorized, sanctioned, working with permission, then the monster you were handed in Sunday school, in Hollywood, in 1,000 paintings of red fire and curling horns, that monster was not discovered in Scripture. He was constructed, assembled, gradually and deliberately built from pieces that, taken individually, do not say what we were told they say. And if that is true, if the Prince of Darkness began as something closer to a divine attorney than a cosmic villain, then the entire architecture of Western morality, the war between good and evil that has shaped your politics and your guilt and your understanding of suffering for 2,000 years, rests on a foundation that was poured long after the original building was designed. The floor beneath your feet is not ancient bedrock. It is a renovation, and someone chose not to tell you when the walls were moved. What follows is not an attack on faith. It is not a dismissal of the spiritual traditions that billions of people carry as something sacred and real. It is a forensic examination of a textual and historical record that belongs to all of us. Documents that predate Christianity. Scholarship that has been available for decades. A transformation that happened in plain sight across centuries of manuscripts that you can hold in your hands. The texts are real. The dates are verifiable. You deserve to see what they actually say. Consider the weight of that. Consider what it means that the fall of Lucifer, the story that gives Western civilization its central metaphor for pride and hubris, and the ruin of greatness. That is the source of the phrase, "Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven." That is the foundation of the most sympathetic villain in the English literary tradition, as Milton drew him in Paradise Lost, is built on a text that was describing something else entirely. A dead king, a pagan myth repurposed as political satire, a moment in the long history of prophetic rhetoric when an Israelite writer reached for the most powerful image of catastrophic overreach available in the cultural vocabulary of his time and turned it into a weapon against Babylon. That text was never about eternity. It was about an empire that fell. And when Jerome translated it into Latin in the late 4th century and chose the word Lucifer for the morning star, he was making a literary decision, a choice of vocabulary, not a theological declaration. The declaration came later, made by other hands, building on Jerome's foundation without Jerome's full awareness of what they were building. Is that not what most inherited structures look like up close? Not a conspiracy, not a deliberate deception. A series of choices, each locally reasonable, each made by someone doing their best with the materials at hand, that accumulate into an edifice so massive and so ancient-seeming that no one inside it can see the scaffolding that was never taken down. The New Testament receives this assembled figure and intensifies him beyond anything the Hebrew material had authorized. By the time we reach the Gospel of John, written perhaps as late as 100 CE, Satan is called the ruler of this world 3 times. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul, writing in the 50s CE, in the earliest stratum of the New Testament, calls him the God of this age, who has blinded the minds of unbelievers. In the letter to the Ephesians, whether written by Paul or by a later author in his tradition, he is the prince of the power of the air. These are not the titles of a divine employee carrying out authorized tests. These are the titles of a rival sovereignty, a counterfeit kingship, a being who has so thoroughly infiltrated the structure of human reality that the very atmosphere of the world belongs to him. What makes this expansion intelligible? And this is where Elaine Pagels, in her central 1995 work, The Origin of Satan, makes her most important contribution, is the social context in which it occurs. The communities producing the New Testament documents were minority communities under pressure. They understood themselves to be in profound conflict, not only with Roman imperial power but with other Jewish communities from whom they had recently separated, and with the temple establishment of Jerusalem, and with a Greco-Roman culture that regarded them as, at best, a minor nuisance, and at worst, a dangerous subversion. In that context, Satan becomes a cosmological frame for social conflict. Your opponents are not simply mistaken. They are not merely wrong on questions of theology or practice. They are operating, knowingly or not, as agents of a supernatural adversary. The logic of spiritual warfare maps onto the experience of marginalization and persecution, and in doing so it gives that suffering a dignity and a cosmic weight that mere political opposition could not supply. But here is what you need to hold alongside that. The figure of Satan in the Gospels is deployed not primarily against Rome, not primarily against paganism. It is deployed against other Jews. In the Gospel of John, Jesus tells his Jewish opponents, "You are from your father, the devil." In Matthew 23, the Pharisees are called sons of hell. In Revelation chapter 2, a Jewish community in Smyrna is called the synagogue of Satan. And the Qumran community, the Jewish sectarian group whose library we recovered as the Dead Sea Scrolls, who wrote texts between roughly 200 BCE and 68 CE, describes their Jewish opponents as the sons of darkness, and themselves as the sons of light. Satan, in these texts, is not the name of a being found by examination of reality. He is the name assigned to the other side of whatever boundary your community has drawn around itself. He is a social technology, a mechanism for making your opponents cosmically, rather than merely humanly, wrong. And once you can do that, once you can move your enemy from the human register to the metaphysical one, you no longer need to argue with them. You need to defeat them. The conversation ends, and only the conflict remains. The medieval church receives this fully formed figure and does something with it that is, in its own way, magnificent in its scope and disturbing in its implications. It completes him. It furnishes him. It gives him the iconography that still lives in your visual imagination. The wings of a fallen angel. The horns borrowed from the imagery of Pan, and from the ram-horned pagan gods that Christianity absorbed and relabeled as it moved through the cultures of the Roman Empire. The red skin drawn from the heat of the infernal regions. The cloven hooves from the attributes of nature gods across the Mediterranean world. The pitchfork from the trident of Neptune, and the agricultural imagery of divine punishment. Satan becomes a composite being assembled from the rejected gods of conquered traditions, a figure in which every deity that Christianity displaced was dumped and rebranded as demonic. The devil is, in part, a trophy case of beaten religions. He is wearing the features of every god that lost. But the medieval construction does something even more consequential than give Satan a costume. It gives him an origin story that reaches all the way back to the first pages of Genesis and makes him seem as old as creation itself. The serpent in the Garden of Eden, described in Genesis chapter 3, simply as the most clever of the wild animals that God had made, had no supernatural identity in the original text. It is an animal, a speaking animal, which is strange, but its speech is attributed to its own cleverness, not to any external possessing spirit. The oldest scholarly interpretations of the Eden narrative, in the rabbinic tradition and in the earliest Christian commentary, show significant disagreement about what the serpent represents: wisdom, deception, the boundary between the human and divine realms, the ambiguity of knowledge itself. What it does not represent in the Hebrew text as written is Satan. The identification of the serpent with the devil occurs in the Wisdom of Solomon, a Jewish text written in Greek approximately in the 1st century BCE. Through the devil's envy, death entered the world. That single sentence is a suture. It takes two separate narratives, the Eden story from Genesis and the evolving figure of the supernatural adversary from apocalyptic literature, and joins them. And once that suture is made in the tradition's flesh, it heals over invisibly. The revelation of John, writing approximately 95 CE, seals it permanently by calling Satan the ancient serpent, the deceiver of the whole world. By the time Irenaeus of Lyons is writing his Against Heresies in the late 2nd century CE, it is simply assumed, stated as obvious, requiring no argument, that Satan tempted Eve and initiated the corruption of the human race. The assumption has the weight of antiquity, because no one has gone back to check when it was first made. What does it mean to trace a suture that has been invisible for 2,000 years? It means accepting that the story you are given, coherent, continuous, ancient, was assembled from discontinuous fragments by human beings working under pressure, with specific theological needs in specific historical moments. It does not mean the story has no power or no truth. It means the power and the truth belong to something other than the history we were told it had. And claiming that is not an act of destruction. It is an act of genuine respect for the tradition as it actually exists. Complicated, evolving, human in the fullest and most dignified sense of that word. Henry Ansgar Kelly, whose 2006 work, Satan, a Biography, is among the most exhaustive single-volume treatments of this history, argues that the tradition systematically misread its own texts, and that this misreading had consequences for Western civilization that we are still navigating. The doctrine of original sin as formulated by Augustine of Hippo in the late 4th and early 5th century CE required a primordial rebellion, a cosmic fall that preceded the human fall. An agent of corruption who introduced evil into a good creation from outside. And Augustine found that agent in Lucifer, in the Isaiah text, in the assembled mythology of Second Temple apocalypticism, and Zoroastrian dualism, and Greco-Roman demonology that had by his time been circulating in the Christian imagination for 300 years. The theology of the fall, the doctrine that underlies the necessity of redemption, the logic of the atonement, the entire soteriological architecture of Western Christianity, depends on this figure being what he is not in the oldest texts. It depends on him being ancient, primordial, inherent to the structure of creation. And so the renovation was sealed over. The original floor was tiled with something newer and declared to be original. Why does this matter to you in 2026? In a world where the average person's daily encounter with Satan is likely limited to Halloween decorations and horror streaming. It matters because the structure of thought that this figure made possible did not disappear when the theology that created him began to loosen its cultural grip. The logic of the absolute enemy, the being whose existence justifies unlimited opposition, who cannot be reasoned with because he is not merely wrong, but cosmically wrong, who represents not a competing argument, but a competing ontology. That logic migrated out of the cathedral and into the street. It lives in the political language of every movement that needs to make its opponents not just incorrect, but evil. It lives in the media ecosystem that has discovered, over and over, that making your viewers feel they are living inside a cosmic battle between good and evil is the most powerful retention mechanism ever devised. It lives in the ease with which the word evil is reached for to shut down rather than open up thinking. to foreclose rather than to interrogate, to perform conviction rather than exercise it. Every time a society's conversation collapses from argument into war, from disagreement into demonic attribution, it is reaching into this archive. It is picking up a tool that was forged in the 2nd century BCE under Hellenistic pressure and refined across the Roman imperial period and hammered into final shape by the hammer blows of ecclesiastical authority in the early medieval church. The tool works. It has always worked. That is not a compliment. It is a warning. The Satan of Job returns to the divine council at the end of each assignment. He delivers his report. He waits for the next instruction. He is a creature of the system he serves. And within that system he has a function. That is, if not benign, at least contained. The horror of the transformation we have traced is not that human beings invented an adversary. Every tradition invents adversaries. The horror is that the adversary was cut loose from the system that contained him, given independence, given sovereignty, given a kingdom. And once that happened, once the adversary became a ruler rather than an officer, a god rather than a functionary, a cosmic principle rather than a narrative device, the language of opposition became infinite. There was no longer any ceiling on how evil your enemy could be. There was no longer any floor beneath which your resistance must not go. The war became eternal, and eternal wars, as you know, are not won. They are only perpetuated. You have now followed this history, from its origin to its consequence, from the court officer in the divine assembly, roaming and reporting, to the winged tyrant at the center of the lowest circle of Dante's cosmos. From a Hebrew common noun, that means the one who opposes to the proper name of the most elaborately constructed supernatural villain in human imagination. What you hold now is not a refutation of faith. It is something more useful than that. It is the understanding that the stories we tell about evil are stories that we choose, that they were chosen before us by people working under specific pressures and specific needs, and that we inherit those choices without ever being told they were made. Knowing that, you can make different ones, not easier ones. There is nothing easy about returning your enemies to the human register, about insisting on argument where apocalyptic warfare would be more satisfying, about treating disagreement as something to be worked through rather than cosmically defeated. Nothing easy about any of that, but honest. And in the long history we have been tracing, honesty about how our ideas were built is the only tool that has ever actually changed them. If this kind of forensic archaeology of the ideas that shaped your world is the work that calls to you, follow it, share it, keep it moving. Because the archive is longer than any single investigation, the record is deeper than any single document, and what waits in the next layer of the excavation is always stranger and more consequential than what you found in the last. The adversary's real history is there in the texts, available to anyone willing to look. And the most dangerous thing in that history is not the devil. It is the discovery that we built him ourselves, for reasons we are still living inside of, and called him eternal. You have now followed this history, from its origin to its consequence, from the court officer in the divine assembly, roaming and reporting, to the winged tyrant at the center of the lowest circle of Dante's cosmos. From a Hebrew common noun, that means the one who opposes to the proper name of the most elaborately constructed supernatural villain in human imagination. What you hold now is not a refutation of faith. It is something more useful than that. It is the understanding that the stories we tell about evil are stories that we choose, that they were chosen before us by people working under specific pressures and specific needs, and that we inherit those choices without ever being told they were made. Knowing that, you can make different ones, not easier ones. There is nothing easy about returning your enemies to the human register, about insisting on argument where apocalyptic warfare would be more satisfying, about treating disagreement as something to be worked through rather than cosmically defeated. Nothing easy about any of that, but honest. And in the long history we have been tracing, honesty about how our ideas were built is the only tool that has ever actually changed them. If this kind of forensic archaeology of the ideas that shaped your world is the work that calls to you, follow it, share it, keep it moving. Because the archive is longer than any single investigation, the record is deeper than any single document, and what waits in the next layer of the excavation is always stranger and more consequential than what you found in the last. The adversary's real history is there in the texts, available to anyone willing to look. And the most dangerous thing in that history is not the devil. It is the discovery that we built him ourselves, for reasons we are still living inside of, and called him eternal. What does it mean to live after this investigation? What does it mean to carry the knowledge that the most powerful villain in the Western imagination was assembled piece by piece from borrowed Persian cosmology, misread Babylonian satire, apocalyptic Jewish sectarianism, and a series of Latin translation choices made by scholars working under deadline in the late Roman Empire? It does not mean living without the concept of evil. Evil is real. The harm that human beings do to one another, systematic, deliberate, institutionalized harm, does not require a supernatural explanation to be genuine and serious and demanding of response. What it means is living with a more precise vocabulary, a vocabulary that locates evil in choices and systems, and the accumulated weight of structural conditions, rather than in a single personified adversary whose existence relieves us of the obligation to understand how ordinary human beings, inside ordinary human institutions, produce extraordinary suffering. The banality of evil, as Arendt named it, is not a comfort. It is harder to face than the dramatic alternative. But it is where the actual work lives, and the actual work is the only thing that leaves the world different when you are finished. The Satan of Job returns to the divine council. At the end of each assignment, he delivers his report. He waits for the next instruction. He is a creature of the system he serves, and within that system he has a function that is, if not benign, at least contained and bounded by authority above him. He cannot exceed his authorization. He operates within limits set by a higher power. The horror of the transformation we have traced is not that human beings invented an adversary. Every tradition invents adversaries, because every tradition needs a way to think about the opposition it encounters and the suffering it cannot explain. The horror is that the adversary was cut loose from the system that contained him, given independence, given sovereignty, given a kingdom that operated outside any accountability structure, beyond any negotiation, past any possibility of reform or restraint. And once that happened, once the adversary became a ruler rather than an officer, a god rather than a functionary, an eternal principle rather than a contextual tool, the language of opposition became limitless. There was no longer any ceiling on how evil your enemy could be declared. There was no longer any floor beneath which your response must not descend. Because if your enemy is the embodiment of cosmic evil, then whatever you do in opposition to him is, by the internal logic of the framework, cosmic good. That logic is airtight. It has also been present at every atrocity committed in the name of righteousness for the last 15 centuries. You have now followed this history from its origin to its consequence, from the court officer and the divine assembly roaming and reporting, to the winged tyrant frozen at the center of Dante's infernal universe, grinding the bodies of the greatest traitors of history between his three mouths, weeping in eternal cold. From a Hebrew common noun, that means the one who opposes to the proper name of the most elaborately imagined supernatural villain in the recorded history of human culture. What you hold now is not a refutation of faith. It is something more durable than that. It is the understanding that the stories we tell about evil are choices, that they were made before us by people working under specific pressures in specific historical moments, and that we inherit those choices without being informed that they were ever made. Knowing that, you can choose differently, not more easily. There is nothing easy about returning your enemies to the human register, about demanding argument where apocalyptic warfare would be more satisfying, about insisting that the person across the divide is humanly wrong rather than cosmically evil. None of that is easy, but it is honest, and honesty about how our ideas were constructed is the only foundation on which different ideas can actually stand. If this forensic archaeology of the stories that shaped your inherited world is the kind of work that matters to you, follow it forward. Share it with the people in your life who are ready to look at the foundations of what they were given. Keep the investigation moving. Because the archive is longer than any single documentary, the record goes deeper than any single layer of excavation. And the next revelation waiting at the bottom of the next dig is always stranger and more consequential than the one you just reached. The adversary's actual history is there in the texts, available, legible, waiting for anyone who is willing to look at what the documents say rather than what the tradition insists they mean. And the most powerful thing you can do with that history is refuse to look away. By the end of this, you will know exactly when and why Satan stopped being a servant of God and became his enemy. And you will understand why that single transformation, that quiet editorial decision made across centuries of theological revision, became the most consequential story the Western world has ever told itself. The Hebrew word is ha-Satan, 2 words actually. The definite article, ha, meaning the, and Satan, a common noun meaning adversary, accuser, or one who opposes. It is a role, not a name. It is a function, not a being. Think of it the way you think of the prosecutor, or the inspector general, or the opposing counsel, a title granted by an institution to a person serving a specific purpose within that institution's machinery. When you encounter ha-Satan in the oldest layers of the Hebrew Bible, in texts that scholars date to the period of the Babylonian exile and the post-exilic restoration, roughly the 6th through 4th centuries, before the Common Era, you are not meeting a supernatural villain, you are meeting a job description. In the book of Numbers, chapter 22, the angel of the Lord stands in the road as an adversary, as a Satan, against the prophet Balaam. That angel is sent by God. He is not opposing God. He is the instrument of divine obstruction, placed precisely to prevent Balaam from completing a journey the Lord has decided to impede. The Satan here is on God's side. He is doing divine work. The fact that he is blocking the road does not make him evil. It makes him effective. He is a bureaucratic tool of heaven, and the road he blocks leads away from where God has decided the story should go. And yet somewhere between that text and the cultural imagination you inherited, the road blocker became the road builder, the one who paves the highway to hell. What do you do with that? What do you do with the realization that the earliest appearances of this word, in the very tradition that produced the devil, do not describe a devil at all? You sit with it. You let it be uncomfortable. Because the discomfort is the beginning of the real history. The problem with inherited ideas is not that they are wrong. Many of them are not wrong, or at least not entirely. The problem is that they arrive pre-authorized, bearing the weight of centuries of ascent, dressed in the gravity of things that have always been believed. They do not announce themselves as constructions. They announce themselves as facts, and the only way to see a construction clearly is to find the moment before it was built, when the materials were still separate and the blueprints had not yet been drawn. That moment, for the figure who became Satan, is recoverable. It lives in the texts. It has been waiting there the entire time. In 1 Chronicles chapter 21, Satan incites David to take a census of Israel, and this act results in catastrophe. 70,000 people dying of plague. But here is what was not included in your education. In the parallel account in 2 Samuel chapter 24, recording the same event, the same census, the same disaster. It is not Satan who incites David. It is God. The anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he incited David against them. The two texts cannot both be literally true in the way we have been taught to read them. Scholars have wrestled with this discrepancy for centuries, and what it reveals is not corruption or conspiracy, but evolution, a slow shift in theological sensibility across generations of editors and redactors, in which the uncomfortable idea of a God who directly causes human suffering was gradually outsourced to a figure who could absorb that darkness without staining the divine. The Satan is not a rebellion against the cosmic order. He is a theological solution to a theological problem. He is where God's harder decisions go to be explained. The Book of Job sits at the center of this evolution like a hinge, and the scholar Neil Forsyth, in his landmark 1987 study, The Old Enemy, Satan and the Combat Myth, identifies it as one of the most philosophically dense texts in the entire biblical corpus. A text that is wrestling openly, in dramatic form, with the question that no neat theology can answer. Why does the righteous person suffer? The Ha-Satan of Job appears in the divine council, in the Bene Ha-Elohim, the sons of God, and he has clearly been traveling on the earth, roaming and walking upon it, which suggests this is a regular activity, an assigned beat. When God asks him where he has been, he answers without shame or concealment. He reports. He is reporting to a superior. And when he is given permission to afflict Job, he proceeds only within the limits God explicitly sets. First, do not touch his flesh. Then, after the first round of suffering, you may touch his flesh, but spare his life. These are the boundaries of an authorized operation. A signed work order from the divine. The Ha-Satan of Job is not freelancing. He is not acting out of malice. He is carrying out a sanctioned test. And the question the book is really asking, the question that the entire frame story of the divine wager is designed to hold open, is whether human faith can survive the full weight of permitted suffering. The adversary is not the villain of that story. He is the mechanism by which the question is posed. Where, then, does the monster come from? Where does the winged tyrant of Christian imagination enter the story? Where does the fallen Lucifer, the prince of darkness, the enemy of all righteousness, take shape? He enters from outside. He enters, carried on the currents of a world that Hebrew scripture was increasingly unable to resist. A world that, after Alexander the Great's conquests in the 4th century before the Common Era, had become drenched in Persian and Zoroastrian ideas about the structure of the cosmos. Zoroastrianism, the religion of ancient Iran that dominated the Persian Empire, under which Jewish communities spent generations in exile and return, was built on a foundational dualism that Hebrew monotheism was not. Its great god, Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, was locked in primordial combat with Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit, the hostile mind. And this battle was not a temporary condition awaiting resolution. It was the engine of existence itself. Creation was a battlefield. Good and evil were co-equal in the drama of the cosmos, and the world was the theater of their war. You were taught that Christianity inherited everything from Judaism. That is partially true, but you were not taught that Judaism, in the centuries immediately before Christianity's emergence, had spent hundreds of years absorbing, adapting, and sometimes wholesale importing from Persian cosmological frameworks that were entirely foreign to the oldest layers of the tradition, the apocalyptic literature that explodes in the Second Temple period. Texts like First Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, the War Scroll from Qumran. These texts are saturated with cosmic dualism. In them, evil is not a divine instrument, it is a rival army. The cosmos is not a hierarchy with God at the apex. It is a war zone with fronts and casualties, and a final decisive battle still approaching over the horizon. And at the head of the opposing army stands a figure whose names multiply like a fever: Azazel, Mastema, Belial, and yes, Satan. But now Satan as a proper noun, as an identity, as a being who has declared himself against the divine order, rather than serving within it. The contact between Jewish and Persian thought was not incidental. It was sustained and structural. The Jewish community had lived under Persian imperial authority for roughly 2 centuries, from the fall of Babylon to Alexander's conquest in 331 BCE, and the influence of Achaemenid religious culture on Second Temple Judaism is a subject that scholars including John Collins of Yale, in his foundational work on apocalypticism, and Mary Boyce, in her multi-volume history of Zoroastrianism, have documented in careful detail. What emerged from this contact was not a simple borrowing. Jewish writers were creative and selective in what they took, but a profound reorientation of the imagination toward dualistic conflict as the explanatory framework for human experience. Why does evil exist? Not because God uses it as a tool. Because there is another power, real and autonomous, whose nature is opposed to the divine. Why do the righteous suffer? Not because God is testing them, because a war is being fought around them and through them, and they are caught in its crossfire. These answers felt, to the communities that adopted them, more honest than what the older tradition had supplied. They felt truer to the experience of exile and persecution, and the grinding opacity of history. And so they took root. They spread. They became the water in which early Christianity swam, so thoroughly mixed into the environment that almost no one noticed they had not always been there. The transformation happens over roughly 3 centuries, from about 300 BCE to the 1st century CE, and Jeffrey Burton Russell traces this development in painstaking detail in his 4-volume study of the devil in Western thought, beginning with The Devil: Perceptions of Evil from Antiquity to Primitive Christianity, published in 1977. What Russell demonstrates is that the Satan of the Hebrew Bible does not simply grow into the devil of the New Testament by natural maturation, the way a sapling grows into a tree along a continuous line. He is grafted. He receives, across this period, attributes that were never his in the original material: pride, rebellion, envy of humanity, a desire to corrupt rather than merely to test. A biography that extends before creation itself. In First Enoch, chapters 6 through 11, the Watchers, divine beings who descend to earth, take human women and corrupt the human race with forbidden knowledge, are the origin point of evil in the cosmos. Their leader, Azazel, is bound and thrown into darkness to await the final judgment. This is a fall. This is, structurally, the template that will later be applied to Satan. But it is borrowed architecture. It is a building constructed from Persian materials and placed on a Hebrew foundation, and the seam between the two is visible to anyone willing to look. And then comes the text, or rather, the mistranslation of a text. That will, over the course of Western history, calcify into a doctrine so hardened that virtually no one will remember it was ever a reading rather than a revelation. Isaiah chapter 14, verse 12. The King James Bible renders it, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning." This verse has been used for 1,500 years to establish the myth of Satan's original fall, the primordial rebellion, the war in heaven, the angel whose pride turned him into a devil. Lucifer, the light-bearer, cast down from the heights into the pit. It is one of the most powerful images in Western religious history. It is the foundation of Milton, Satan, and Dante's traitor at the center of the universe, and 100 horror films and 1,000 sermons. And according to the consensus of biblical scholars, John Day of Oxford, in his 2000 work Yahweh and the Gods and Goddesses of Canaan, Joseph Blenkinsop's commentary on Isaiah in the Anchor Bible series, and Walter Brueggemann's theological readings of the prophets, this passage is almost certainly not about Satan at all. Is that not the crack that changes everything? Is that not the fault line beneath the cathedral? The Hebrew text says, "How you have fallen from heaven, Hillel ben Shakar, shining one, son of the dawn." The consensus among Old Testament scholars is that this passage is a taunt directed against the king of Babylon, probably Nebuchadnezzar or one of his successors, using the imagery of a Canaanite myth about a lesser deity who attempted to climb to the throne of the Most High God and was cast down. It is political satire dressed in mythological clothing. The Babylonian king thought himself celestial. Isaiah is telling him he was mortal all along. The word Hellel, translated by Jerome in the Latin Vulgate of approximately 405 CE as Lucifer, the name he chose for this shining morning star, means radiant or brilliant, and it refers to the planet Venus as the morning star, the last and brightest light before the sun rises. It is not a proper name for an angel. It is a metaphor for an empire that rose bright and fell before dawn. Jerome's translation became the dominant biblical text of the Western Church, the standard against which all other readings were measured for over 1,000 years. And in that translation, the metaphor hardened into a name. The name hardened into a being. The being acquired a history, and 15 centuries of Christian imagination built upon that foundation, constructing the most elaborate villain in the history of human storytelling, on the bedrock of a translation choice made by one scholar in the late Roman Empire about a Hebrew poem aimed at a Babylonian king.